The sun bled low against the horizon, painting the town's false front buildings in the colors of fire and ash. Dust drifted in slow ribbons down Main Street, and already the townsfolk had gathered near the church steps where a young widow sat slumped like something the storm had tossed in. Her face was pale beneath the grime, her dress threadbare, and her eyes carried the hollow weight of someone who had not slept beneath a roof in far too long. Miriam Holt, 22 and already stamped by death and loss, barely lifted her gaze as whispers swirled around her like vultures. "She's cursed," Lydia Crenshaw muttered loud enough for the whole town to hear. "A husband dead, no kin, and nowhere to go. You take her in, and bad luck follows." Children pressed close to their mothers, men shook their heads, and the preacher stood stiff in his doorway, clutching his Bible as if it might keep the shame from staining the porch. Harlan McCrae had not meant to stop. He was only passing by with his boy Caleb, heading to the blacksmith. But the way Caleb froze, staring at the widow as though she were some broken creature left out on the road, pulled him down short. "Papa," Caleb whispered, tugging on his father's worn coat. "Why's she shaking like the calves when they're left out?" The rancher looked once at the woman and then at the faces of the town, each one turned away or sneering. His jaw tightened. In a place where decency was always preached but rarely practiced, silence could be as cruel as a lash. Harlan set his hat back on his head and stepped toward her. The crowd shifted. He dropped to one knee beside her, and in the hush that followed, the widow finally raised her eyes. They were blue but dulled, rimmed red with hunger and humiliation. He offered her a piece of bread from his satchel. She flinched back as though it were a stone. "Don't," she said hoarsely. "If they see you help me, they'll turn on you too." His voice was steady, quiet as rain on dry soil. "They've turned on me before." The words hung heavy, and for the first time that morning, the town looked at Harlan instead of her. He had been a widower for 4 years, a man who kept mostly to his spread at the edge of the valley, raising his boy and saying little. Folks like to invent their own stories about quiet men. Reverend Josiah Kane stepped forward, his voice carrying like the toll of a bell. "The good book says, 'A broken reed he will not break, and a faintly burning wick he will not quench.'" His eyes lingered on Miriam. "But not all wicks can be rekindled." Harlan ignored him. He set the bread in her lap. Caleb, small hands shaking with a child's certainty, took off his blanket and draped it around Miriam's shoulders. She trembled, and in that gesture her eyes glistened, but she did not speak. The gossip bloomed like wildfire by evening. In the saloon, they said McCrae had lost his sense. In the mercantile, they claimed the widow was nothing but a beggar waiting to pull him down. By nightfall, Miriam sat inside Harlan's wagon, watching the lamplight from the cabin window paint gold across the prairie grass. She could leave at any moment. And yet the way Caleb had smiled when he offered her a chair at supper lingered in her chest like warmth she did not deserve. "They beat you every day," Harlan said softly as he laid another log on the fire. His eyes, deep as old wells, found hers. "And I want someone to stay." She shook her head, fingers twisting in her lap. "You don't even know me. I know you've been left too long in the dust." The silence that followed was thick, broken only by the hiss of the log. Then she saw the chair he had pulled out for her, plain wood but waiting, as though he had known she might sit. Tears threatened to spill, but she pressed them back. Days passed. She tended Caleb when he coughed at night, humming a tune half-remembered from her mother. She patched Harlan's shirt by lamplight though her own clothes were falling to rags. He watched her not with pity but with the quiet steadiness of a man who saw beyond what the town called shame. Yet the town did not forget. Lydia Crenshaw confronted her at the well. "No good comes from stealing a widower's kindness. You're a shadow, Miriam Holt, and shadows don't build homes." Her throat closed, but she carried the bucket back to the ranch, every step burning with humiliation. That night she resolved to leave. She folded the borrowed blanket and set it by the door. But when her hand touched the latch, Harlan's voice came from the dark. "You'll go back to the streets. Is that what you want?" "They'll tear you apart for keeping me," she said, voice breaking. "I won't drag you under." He stepped closer, his presence filling the room like something carved from stone. The prophet said, The best of you are those who are best to women. You think I'd let go of that truth just because folks whisper? The storm broke that night, rain lashing the windows, thunder shaking the walls. Caleb burned with fever, his body small and frail against the bed. Miriam stayed at his side, cloth against his brow, her voice low as she sang a lullaby. Harlan stood in the doorway, watching her, the lamplight catching her face as though she were carved in gold and fire. By dawn, Caleb's fever broke. The boy stirred, whispering her name. Miriam bowed her head, silent tears streaking her cheeks. In that moment, something shifted between her and the man who had stood beside her. But Sunday brought the true test. The town gathered, eyes sharp as blades. Miriam stepped back, ready to slip away before more stones were thrown with words. Harlan caught her hand before she could move. "She's mine to stand beside," he said to the preacher, to the town, to every whisper that had followed them. "I don't want a helper. I want a wife." Gasps broke the stillness. Some spat on the ground, others crossed their arms. Reverend Cain's face was unreadable. Then, in a voice solemn as the grave, he said, "What God joins, no man may tear apart." But before Miriam could breathe the air of relief, Lydia Crenshaw's voice rose sharp as glass. "You fool, McCrae. Ask her where she comes from. Ask her what she hides." The town froze. Miriam's body went rigid, eyes wide. Harlan turned to her, and for a heartbeat the world held its breath. Her voice cracked as she spoke, each word a blade against her throat. "My husband didn't die in a mine cave-in. He was murdered by your sheriff. And they told me if I spoke, they'd hang me for it." The gasp was louder this time, a storm of disbelief and fury. Faces turned, some toward the jailhouse, some toward the church. The preacher's hand trembled against his Bible. Harlan did not move from her side. He looked at the woman the town had branded cursed and saw not shame but the fire of truth burning through her fear. Slowly, he turned back to the crowd. "You wanted a reason to cast her out," he said, voice low but carrying. "Now you have one you can't swallow." The storm of voices broke, men shouting, women clutching their children. But Miriam stood taller, tears drying on her cheeks. For the first time in years, she felt the weight of silence lift. And when the crowd thinned, when the prairie wind rose to carry away the dust of judgment, Harlan placed his hand over hers and led her back toward the cabin. The narrator's voice settled in like the crackle of a dying fire. "Sometimes the world will beat you hollow, call you names that burn the soul. But one hand held steady, one voice unshaken, can change the course of a life." They thought the widow carried only shame. Instead, she carried truth, and a man willing to stand beside it. And that was enough to begin again.